Hello and welcome, friend, to History Raids with Fjorn. And no, it's not as violent as it sounds. I'm Fjorn the Skald, your host with a master's degree in history, here to pillage the past on your behalf, metaphorically. The plunder you're about to hear today was originally produced in 2018, when I was still working on my master's. As a result, some information may be outdated by the time you're listening to this. My past self could even be wrong. If so, you can send corrections via the contact form linked in this episode's description. There, you will also find links to the sources I used in this episode, for your extra plundering pleasure. You can also find even more resources at fjorntheskald.com, including interactive digital maps. I should also note that this podcast supports inclusivity, regardless of race, and stands as an ally with the LGBTQ+ community. If you want to support this show and its Skald, simply share it around like Odin's ravens. You can also send a humble tip to my Ko-fi.com page. If you are a fan of fantasy, though, you could just go read or listen to my web novels that I serialize for free under the name Feolnir. That would, in fact, bring me the most joy. But anyway, that's enough blathering from me. Let's get on to the whole raiding history thing.
Today we'll be talking about a remarkable woman named Aud from Norway, who boldly escaped from Scotland after her family lost power there, led her remaining kinsmen to safety, took leadership over her family, and settled a large portion of Iceland, which she herself distributed amongst her crew and kin. Her renown was even known to the medieval historians of Iceland, such as the prominent Ari the Learned. In his work called Íslendingabók, or the Book of Icelanders, he listed her among the 4 most influential settlers of Iceland, asserting that from her the people of Breiðafjord are descended. Indeed, she seems to have been quite the exceptional woman. She was a bold hero and even a founding mother for an entire region of Iceland. Such a story truly captivates and inspires us even today, does it not? But there is a catch. Although we typically refer to her as Aud the Deep-minded in English, she's not actually always called by that name, nor do all the stories about her agree on the details of her life. She is called both Unr, meaning wave, and Oidr, meaning wealth, and she is also called both the deep-minded and the deeply wealthy. As for the sagas about her, some portray her as a more worldly, dynastic, and independent figure, while others emphasize her Christian piety, generosity, and even marginality within a pagan society. So what will we do about this, my friends? Well, we'll do what we always seek to do here in Fjorn's Hall, to work together as a fellowship to both enjoy and understand the sagas and legends of the medieval North. So we'll start things off by sharing her story one saga at a time, recounting her accomplishments and rekindling the flames of cultural memory that surround her. And along the way, I'll share my thoughts and offer bits of commentary, which sometimes turn into academic tangents, but I'll generally try to save most of the academic input for the end of the gathering, which should help us make sense of all this. If not, we'll at least be able to tell our friends who desperately need more sagas in their lives about Aud the Deep-minded, an impressive woman who once lived in the medieval North. But before we begin, I'd like to give my thanks to a few notable guests and wanderers in the hall today. First, I'd like to thank Professor Carolyn Larrington from Oxford University for suggesting that I speak to an independent PhD scholar named Sophie van Herpen, who's working with Ghent University. Sophie is currently devoting so much of her time and passion to a project about the various representations of Aud/Un in both medieval and early modern Icelandic literature. She has also been kind enough to respond to my emails and offer her support. And so, of course, I'd like to offer my thanks to her as well, since she has been a tremendous help in organizing and preparing this podcast gathering for you all today. So I highly encourage all of my guests to explore her research and blog through the media links that I've included in the description for this gathering. She is doing wonderful work and deserves our support. I should also admit, however, that we cannot cover all of the wonderful things there are to say about Aud the Deep-minded in a single gathering, nor do my summaries of her sagas do her story any true justice. But just as any other historian interpreting the past, I too have made choices and established priorities that unfortunately omit many of the other important and valuable details. But with that said, our focus today is to learn about Aud's impressive story, but also to discover who she was within the memories of the authors rewriting that story. And in their retellings, she is called by two names, and although they each refer to the same person, those names represent alternative versions of both her story and her identity. And it is that aspect of Aud the Deep-minded story that we seek to unravel today, although there is much more that we could say about her. But now, without further delay, let us enjoy some sagas. Our first saga is called Laxdæla Saga, or the Saga of the People of Laxdal. It was written in the mid-13th century and belongs to the literary genre known as the Íslendinga sögur, or the sagas of Icelanders. Its events primarily take place during the 10th century in a district known as Dalir in West Iceland, and most of the action unfolds around the settlers of this region and their descendants. And not so coincidentally, the settler for this region is none other than Aud the Deep-minded herself, or rather, I should say, Unn the Deep-minded. This saga begins with the genealogy about her father, a man named Ketil Flatnose. He was a chieftain in Norway and the son of a man named Bjorn Buna, from whom it is said that the most prominent men in all of Iceland are descended. Ketil was married to a woman named Ingvild, and they had 5 children together, but only 3 are really important for today's gathering, so we'll make things simple and cut to the chase. They had a daughter named Unn, the star of today's gathering, and she had 2 brothers, Bjorn the Easterner and Helgi Bjolin. But our saga does not begin with them as children, for Unn was already married to a man named Olaf the White, who was a warrior king in Dublin during the late 9th century. But one day, a king named Harald Fairhair grew so powerful in Norway that no prominent family could thrive there unless they submitted to his rule. And so Ketil called his kinsmen to council, and they decided to flee the land and look abroad for better opportunities. If we were focusing on Ketil, I'd recount his inspirational speech for you all. But for this gathering, it will suffice to say that the saga tells us that Ketil and Unn decided to go west to the British Isles, while Unn's brothers decided to go straight to Iceland. Ketil and Unn ended up in Scotland, where they were well received due to Ketil's renown and the prominence of their family. But our story isn't about Ketil, so let's not offer him too much praise while Unn still awaits our attention. Unn has had a son named Thorstein the Red, who was a promising lad, and as soon as they landed in Scotland, he immediately set off to plunder, raid, and eventually rule half of the Scottish kingdom. But eventually he was betrayed by the Scottish folk and was killed at Caithness. Unn was there when this happened, and to make the situation worse for her, her father was killed as well. And so the leaders of her family had now fallen, and she was trapped in the middle of a foreign kingdom without any political support. But did she wane? Indeed not. Instead of accepting defeat, Unn sprung to action. Even as danger crept around her, she took command and had a ship built secretly in the forest. And when it was complete, she assembled her surviving kinsmen, gathered her family's substantial wealth, and prepared to set sail. As the saga recounts, people say it is hard to find another example of a woman managing to escape from such a hostile situation, with as much wealth and so many followers. It shows what an exceptional woman Unn was. Indeed, this remarkable woman took charge and saved her family from destruction, but her time of action has not yet come to an end. Her first destination was in the Orkneys, where she arranged the marriage of her granddaughter Groa to an earl named Thorfinn, and the saga tells us that all of the earls of Orkney descended from this union. But shortly after that, wasting no time, Unn sailed to the Faroe Islands, where she yet again arranged a marriage, this time for her granddaughter Olof. According to our saga, the most prominent family in that land, the Goturskegi clan, descended from her. As if all of that wasn't impressive enough, Unn quickly made preparations to set sail once again, and so finally we're going to Iceland. And with her was a young lad named Olaf Phelan, who was the son of Thorstein the Red, and of course, Unn still traveled with the several granddaughters that she had not yet arranged marriages for. Although her journey there was smooth, the landing was rough, for her ship was wrecked on the southern shores of Iceland. Luckily though, everyone survived, along with the wealth and property that she rescued from Scotland. And so she continued forward, setting out with 20 men to meet her brother Helgi, who lived at Kjarlanes. But when she arrived there and asked for shelter, Helgi said he would only offer lodgings to her and 9 others, not all 20 members of her company. This poor reception enraged Unn, who refused to stay there after being shown such disrespect. Thus she departed and sought out her brother Bjorn, who lived in Breiðafjord. Unlike Helgi, Bjorn welcomed her with a large company and invited her to stay with him along with all of her companions. As the saga puts it, Bjorn knew well his sister's grand style. Of course, Unn was very pleased and stayed there that winter, but by spring she set off yet again, stopping only in a few places before finally arriving at the head of the fjord, where her high-seat pillars had washed ashore. These objects, especially when cast into the water from a ship, were believed to be guided by divine forces to the place where a person was fated to live, and so she built her own farmstead there, which was and still is called Kvam. Meanwhile, a prominent member of Unn's company was a man named Dalakol. The saga tells us that he married a woman named Thorgerd, who was one of Thorstein the Red's daughters. Unn gave her all of Laxardal as a dowry, and so Thorgerd and Dalakol settled nearby, along the Laxa River. And following this, the saga recounts that Unn gave away many more portions of the land that she claimed to her other companions, which included several slaves that she had set free. And then she arranged marriages between all of those men and her remaining unmarried granddaughters. But the saga now turns to Unn's grandson, Olaf Phelan, and tells us that she has grown weak with age. As she prepared for her approaching death, she intended to leave all of her property in Olaf's hands, and so she urged him to marry someone and settle down. And Olaf, who was a good lad, agreed to this and followed her advice, even saying, "You have made me a generous offer, and the only wife I will take will be the one who will rob you of neither your property nor your authority." And so that autumn, Unn arranged his marriage, which was to be with a woman named Alfdis. The wedding feast was to be held at her farmstead, and many prominent kin and friends attended. But old age was tightening its grip on her. She woke late, retired early to bed, and snapped at anyone who asked about her health. Despite this, she still greeted all of the guests with a proper welcome, giving her thanks to everyone who came. And so the feast was splendid and well attended, and when everyone had gathered there in the hall, Unn made an announcement. "I call upon you, my brothers Bjorn and Helgi, and my other kinsmen and friends, as witnesses. This farm, with all the furnishings you see around you, I hand over to the ownership and control of my grandson Olaf." Then she arose to her feet and retired to her bedchamber, but urged everyone to continue enjoying themselves however they saw fit. As the saga recounts, it is said that Unn was both tall and heavy-set. She walked briskly along the hall, and people commented on her dignified bearing. The feast went quite well, and everyone retired to bed with happy stomachs full of mead. On the following day, Olaf went into Unn's bedchamber to find that she had passed away, but her manner of death was full of dignity, for she was sitting upright among the pillows. As the saga relates, everyone was impressed at how well Unn had kept her dignity to her dying day. But the feast still continued, now commemorating both Olaf's marriage and celebrating the memory of Unn's life. And on the final day of their festivities, Unn was placed on a great ship within a burial mound that had been prepared for her. It was full of great riches, as though it had been prepared for a queen. And so, with her passing and the closing of her lavish burial mound, Unn is now out of the saga. But before we move on to our next saga about her, there are a few things that we should discuss. First of all, it doesn't seem to have been the norm within Norse society for a woman to act as Unn did. As Jenny Jochen says in her book, Women in Old Norse Society, Unn was clearly exceptional, and she was well aware of the authority that male kinsmen could exercise, which is why she arranged marriages for all of her granddaughters to prominent men in both the British Isles and in Iceland. And when she did arrive in Iceland, she claimed as much land as any man could, even though there were technically restrictions limiting the amount of land that a woman could claim. Which, by the way, she was 1 out of 13 female settlers that we know of. In short, Unn's behavior as an independent, rich, and powerful woman actually conforms with the masculine model. This brings us to another important work of scholarship, this time by Carol J. Clover in the form of an article called Regardless of Sex, Men, Women, and Power in Early Northern Europe. In this article, Clover argues that gender in the pre-Christian medieval North was more like a sliding scale than a strict binary. In this system, she suggests that people in Old Norse society were judged according to one, quote, gender, which was masculine. In other words, the more masculine one behaved, the more praise they might have in society, whereas the less masculine one behaved, the more insults and slander they could acquire. Both men and women could slide along this scale, and if we use Unn as an example, we see a woman who takes on masculine roles and wins great praise for it. Of course, there are cases of women who behave in a masculine fashion and receive ridicule instead of praise, such as a woman named Breach's Aud from this saga as well. Although she was praised for taking up arms and exacting revenge when her brothers wouldn't, she was divorced by her husband on the legal grounds against transvestism. Icelandic law didn't seem to be too keen about women wearing the pants of their relationships. But to avoid getting too lost in a deeply theoretical discussion, it'll suffice to say that gender on this scale, which was frequently competitive, was always negotiable, always up for grabs, and always subject to situational conditions. I will add, though, that this gender system is actually strikingly similar to the Old Norse game of honor, which you can read all about in William Ian Miller's book, Blood-Taking and Peacemaking, Feud, Law, and Society in Saga, Iceland, but only if you're feeling adventurous. But to return back to our main point, what actually allowed Unn to claim such a status? How did Unn manage to slide to the positive end of this scale? Let's consider Unn's situation and conditions. All of the male kin that normally held authority over her had been killed. Her son, Thorstein the Red, her father, Kettle Flatnose, and although this saga doesn't clearly say so, we can presume the same about her husband, Olaf the White. As for her brothers, they were far away in Iceland when action needed to be taken. And so Unn took this responsibility upon herself, because there was no one else who could. Indeed, she is praised for behaving according to the masculine model, because it was the necessary and honorable thing to do in her situation, woman or not. But honestly, I don't think we need to spend any more time justifying her actions, seeing as though the saga itself is clearly pleased with her and praises her accomplishments. Whether Unn was an exception within Norse society or not, she was certainly a remarkable woman who is well deserving of the stories that have been told about her. And regardless of the historical reality, these stories, and the memories surrounding her, have served a purpose for its medieval Icelandic audiences, which is what we shall discuss at the end of this gathering. So for now, let's move on to the other sagas about her. Our next saga is called Eyrbyggja Saga, or the Saga of the People of Eyri. And like our previous saga, this saga was also written in the mid-13th century, and belonged to the genre of the sagas of Icelanders. Most of its events take place during the 10th century, centering around the Snæfellsnes region of West Iceland, which is pretty close to the Dalir district. These events primarily deal with the disputes and conflicts between various chieftains in that region, but since these events also take place around Breiðafjord, the region that Aud has been credited with settling, she once again appears, but here in this saga she is called Aud. Nevertheless, this saga also begins with her genealogy, her father Kettle Flatnose, her mother Ingvild, and her brothers Helgi and Bjorn. It is worth noting, however, that Kettle's situation is presented a bit differently in this saga, for he goes to Scotland on King Harold Fairhair's orders instead of fleeing from him. Of course, there is a bit more to it than that, but we're not gathered here today to talk about him, so you'll have to read the saga for yourself if you want more. But after just a bit of political business between Kettle and Harold, Kettle arranged the marriage between Aud and Olaf the White, that warrior king who was best known for ruling over Dublin during the late 9th century. In this saga, however, he is described more broadly as being the greatest warlord in the Western Isles. But instead of focusing on Aud's deeds in Scotland, as we might now expect, the saga shifts its attention to her brother Bjorn instead, who was still in Norway resisting King Harold. Although his story is quite fascinating and involves an interesting man called Thorolf Malsterbeard, who was a close friend to the Old Norse god Thor and had a splendid beard. We're going to skip over it because we're here to talk about his sister Aud, who this saga seems to have neglected. So after some good bits of outlawry and sailing, Fjorn ends up in the Hebrides, where he learned of his father's death. But he was greeted warmly by his brother Helgi and his sisters, which of course included Aud. Yet Fjorn was appalled to discover that they had changed their faiths. Indeed, they now worshipped the Christian god, and thus had forsaken the old gods of the north. As the saga relates, he found it degrading that they had rejected the traditional faith their ancestors had revered. He therefore could not find much pleasure in the place, and he did not want to settle there. Still, he did stay that winter with his sister Aud and her son Thorstein the Red, but it wasn't long before the tension between them was noticeable once again, because they nicknamed him Bjorn the Easterner for his reluctance to settle there with them. After that, the saga only says that Bjorn remained there in the Hebrides for 2 winters before leaving for Iceland. And a few years later, Aud finally arrived in Iceland too, but this time the saga doesn't give us much detail about her journey. We don't hear about Thorstein's death, we don't hear about the secret ship that she had built, we don't hear about any stops in the Orkneys nor in the Faroe Islands, we don't hear about her shipwreck, and we don't hear about her failed attempt to stay with her brother Helgi. Instead, the saga jumps straight into our arrival at Bjorn's home. But even here, we get much less than before, for the saga only says that she spent her first winter with him, and then quickly moves on to say that she took all of the land in the valley in Breiðafjord and lived at Kvam. And if that felt unfulfilling, it only gets worse, because the saga then quickly wraps things up by saying, all of Breiðafjord was settled at this time, but settlers who take no part in this saga do not need to be mentioned here. Yes, I too would like to slam my fist down in anger, for Aud hardly plays a role in this saga. She is merely a silent, passive background figure with no agency whatsoever. We don't even get to hear about her dignified death. Of course that frustrates us, but we do have to keep in mind that this saga has a different overall story to tell. As I said before we spoke of it, this saga is arguably more about political relationships and conflict between powerful chieftains. Laxdæla saga, on the other hand, was far more concerned about Aud's own descendants. In the end, it is always important to keep in mind the overall context of a saga, even when we selectively choose the parts that suit our given cause. Nevertheless, it is clear that Aud has been presented much differently here. She is no longer emphasized as an independent, powerful, and wealthy founding mother, but rather as a passive and almost silent wife and sister to the powerful men around her. But even so, most of her story remains unchanged, although it is terribly brief and summarized in comparison to our last saga. She still went to Scotland with her father, married Olaf the White, had a son named Thorstein, stayed with her brother Bjorn when she arrived in Iceland, and still settled the region at the head of Breiðafjord. Indeed, a lot of details have been left out, but the bones seem to have at least remained the same. But there is one detail that has changed: her religion, for she is now a Christian. Indeed, religion wasn't even a factor for Unn in Laxdæla saga, but we'll talk about this later in our gathering. For now, you should just keep this change in mind, because it would become more apparent as we continue to move forward. And with that said, let's move on to our next saga. Our next saga is called Eirik Saga Rauða, or the Saga of Eirik the Red. This saga was written in the early 13th century, and also belongs to the genre of the sagas of Icelanders. Most of its events, however, take place in the last decade of the 10th century, and also the first quarter of the 11th. But unlike our last 2 sagas, this saga doesn't stick around one region for too long, eventually ending up as far away from Iceland as Greenland and North America. Nevertheless, the saga's namesake briefly ends up settling down in the same region of Iceland that Aud had established. But to make a short story even shorter, he gets outlawed several times, but since he ended up living around Breiðafjord a bit, Aud happens to play a small role in setting up his saga. And her role is indeed small, because she is only in the first chapter of the saga. But even so, I think we'll end up a bit more satisfied than before. The saga actually begins with her husband, Olaf the White, although he is called Olaf here. The account is actually very brief, so bear with me, because things are going to feel like they're moving way too fast. So after conquering Dublin, Olaf married Aud, the daughter of Cantal Flatnose, and together they had a son named Thorstein the Red. But this family is soon torn apart, because the saga quickly kills off Olaf and hastily moves on to Thorstein's greatness as a warrior king himself. But in a typical Game of Thrones fashion, the saga kills him off right away too. And so we already find ourselves at that fateful moment where Aud becomes a bold hero herself. But will this saga let us down? Will she merely be a silent name floating around the story of others? Indeed not, for the saga does tell us that Aud had a ship built secretly in the forest, and that when it was finished, she sailed to the Orkneys, where she arranged the marriage between Groa and Earl Thorfinn. But now we do skip over some things again, for after that, Aud arrived in Iceland with her 20 companions and went straight to Bjorn's home, where they spent their first winter. Then the saga tells us that Aud claimed her land and settled down at Kvam, and that she gave some land to a freed slave named Vifil, who is also mentioned in Laxdæla saga. I told you it would feel a bit fast-paced, but we're not done just yet, because this saga has just a little bit more to say about Aud before concluding her brief role in its overall narrative. The saga adds that she used to pray on a hill called Krossholar, or Cross Hills, telling us that she had crosses erected there because she had been baptized and was a devout Christian. And so, although the overall story presented in this saga has been similar to Laxdæla saga so far, although very short, the Christian side of Aud that we noticed in Eyrbyggja saga appears here as well. There is clearly more to this part of Aud than we first thought, especially since 2 of the 3 sagas that we have covered so far have mentioned it. And although we may feel that Laxdæla saga has given us the most detailed and full depiction of Aud so far, these sagas, which for us feel more like summaries of Laxdæla saga's account, actually reveal something that our first saga omitted. But before we stop to ask questions, there's another story about her that we should explore first, one that gives far more attention to her Christian piety. Our next medieval text is not actually a saga, although one could argue that it is closely related. Instead, we're going to look at a more historical work written sometime during the 12th century called the Nambobok, or the Book of Settlements. But to be a bit more specific, the version we'll be looking at is called Sturlubok, which was compiled by a man named Sturla Thordarson in the 13th century. And an important note should be made about this later author, for he was a member of a powerful family known as the Sturlungs, and his residence was in a very particular place, Kvam. Indeed, he lived at the very farm that Aud herself established in lore from long ago. But we should also be aware that this text recounts the stories of Iceland's settlers, which includes the hero of our gathering today, Aud the Deep-minded. In fact, I should probably also mention that this text has likely served as source material for the sagas that we have already discussed, since it was indeed originally written the century prior to those sagas. But regardless of story order, this work of history and literature presents yet another variation of Aud's impressive tale, one that seems to highlight her religious piety far more than her valiant deeds. But let's discover that for ourselves by sharing the story that it has to offer us. Like our previous saga, Aud's story in the Book of Settlements begins with her husband, Olaf the White. Once again, he is said to have conquered Dublin, married Aud, the daughter of Ketil Flatnose, and no sooner died in battle. And again we have their son together, Thorstein the Red, who himself becomes an impressive warrior king in Scotland before also dying in battle. And yet again, Aud springs to action by having a ship built secretly in the forest, which she uses to sail to the Orkneys, where she married Groa to Earl Thorfinn before sailing to Iceland. Indeed, this story is likely becoming quite repetitive to our ears. But this time, our source tells us that Aud stopped in the Faroe Islands before going to Iceland, where she arranged the marriage of Olof, who was called Olov in Laxdæla saga. This, I will remind you, was not mentioned in our previous 2 sagas, rather only in Laxdæla saga so far. And yet this source continues to include the details we saw in Laxdæla saga, for after that, Aud is said to have wrecked her ship on the southern coast of Iceland before trying to find lodgings with her brother Helgi, who refused to lodge her and her companions, and so, like in Laxdæla saga, Aud went to her brother Bjorn, with whom she stayed for that first winter. There is a subtle difference in this section though, so we should dwell on it for just a moment. Remember how Bjorn welcomed her into his home because he knew well his sister's grand style? In this source, Bjorn is said to have welcomed her because he knew what a noble-minded woman his sister was. Now that may not seem like much right now, but when we consider the overall context of how she is portrayed here, I think we'll find this little detail of value. But for now, we'll carry on. This source then goes on to tell us that Aud departed Bjorn's farmstead that spring, stopping only at 2 places before establishing herself at Kvam, just as things went in Laxdæla saga. And of course, she distributes land to her crew and frees slaves as well. But then we stumble upon a passage that reminds us of Eric's saga. As this source relates, she used to say prayers at Cross Hills. She had crosses erected there, for she'd been baptized and was a devout Christian. But there's actually a bit more, and this part is fascinating. The source goes on to say that her descendants, who reverted back to paganism, began to worship these hills, making sacrifices and eventually even building a pagan temple there. Now, we might expect her story to end there, since most of the sagas that we've covered so far have ended as soon as she settled at Kvam. But finally, at long last, we have a source that continues her story even to her death, which we have not heard about since Laxdæla saga. Will Aud's death be treated in the same way as it was before? Will a Christian woman receive a ship burial in a lavish mound? Let's find out. Like we heard about in Laxdæla saga, the Book of Settlements also tells us that Aud raised Olaf Valen, the son of Thorstein the Red. This source tells us that he indeed married a woman named Alfdis, but never openly tells us that it was Aud who arranged the marriage, although it certainly can be assumed. Nevertheless, after recounting Olaf's children, our source goes on to describe Aud in her old age, saying that she was truly a woman of great dignity. And so far, things seem to be progressing in the same manner as they did in Laxdæla saga. Aud has grown old and weary, and she does indeed plan a feast for her friends and kinsmen. But this time, the reason for the feast isn't clear. If you recall, the feast from Laxdæla saga was to celebrate the marriage of Olaf to Alfdis. But this source remains quiet about the reason, at least at first. And what's more, this source tells us that the feast lasted for a fairly specific period of time. 3 days, and then a brief interlude of gift exchanging, and then another 3 days of festivity. We do, however, get a reason for these additional 3 days, for they were meant to be for her funeral feast. This is once again very similar to how things played out in Laxdæla saga, and I'm sure you're beginning to see why scholars are fairly confident in saying that the Book of Settlements could have been a direct source for that saga, since they each recount these events in nearly the same fashion. But upon Aud's death, our sources diverge, as our source recounts. That very night she died, and she was buried at the high water mark as she'd ordered, because having been baptized, she didn't want to lie in unconsecrated earth. That's certainly no lavish ship burial, if you ask me. For those unfamiliar with Christian burial, it was and is important that a person of faith be laid to rest in consecrated land, or land that had been declared holy. Since Aud lived in a land without a church, for most of Iceland was pagan at the time of settlement, she decided that it would be better to be buried on the shore. But what does this mean? I don't think I can push this off until the end of our gathering, so I'll allow us to take a moment to consider what scholars have said about this moment. In her article, Remembering Unn/Aud, Construction of Cultural Memory and Female Religious Identity, Sophie van Herpen emphasizes the symbolic value that water had within the Christian religion, as a symbol of purification. With that in mind, being buried on the shore could have implied a purifying effect as the tide rolled in and out. But van Herpen, citing the work of Stefan Karlsson, also adds that there was a popular sermon among Icelandic Christians around this time that said that when John baptized himself in the Jordan River, he also consecrated all the water in the world so that it could be used to baptize others. Van Herpen suggests that such a concept might help explain why the author of this text ascribes such a burial to Aud, for it would signify that the shore is consecrated by the water that washes over it. In other words, this burial, unlike the one we heard of in Laxdæla saga, is heavily imbued with Christian symbolism, and so we have nearly identical stories, but one features a secular Unn, while the other flavors Aud with religious significance. Their names are different, and so is the way that they are presented to us. But before we explore the implications of these variations in Aud's story, we have just one more saga to consider. Our final saga is called Grettir Saga, or the Saga of Grettir the Strong. Unlike our previous sagas, which were written in the mid or early 13th century, this saga was probably written sometime during the 14th century. Nevertheless, it still belongs to the genre of the sagas of Icelanders, but comes packaged with the additional flavor that sagas about outlaws have, because this saga jumps all over Iceland and abroad, following the famous outlaw Grettir Asmundarson. But it is because of the cameo that Aud makes in chapter 10 that we are concluding it in our little gathering about her today. In this part of Grettir's saga, we are actually following Grettir's great-grandfather, a man named Onund Treefoot. One day, it is said that he was riding south to an assembly to deal with a legal case involving the death of his friend and father-in-law. But along the way, the saga takes a moment to say that he stayed at Kvam, Aud's farmstead, where he was her guest. At this time, Aud was already at a great age, and her grandson Olaf Phelan was now a grown man. But while Onund stayed there, Aud told him about how she wanted to find him a wife, particularly a woman named Alfdis, who was the cousin of Onund's wife, Asa. And so Aud brought this proposal up with Onund, who shared ties of kinship with Alfdis's family, in hopes that he could help arrange the marriage between them. Fortunately, Onund responded warmly to her proposal and agreed to take Olaf with him on his journey south, and so he did. And when the time came, the saga tells us that the proposal was easily accepted, because people were well aware of how outstanding a woman Aud was. It was therefore on Aud's reputation that the marriage was seen as a worthy match, which truly does say something about her. But the saga quickly wraps up this side quest by saying only that Onund returned and that Aud thanked him for all of his assistance, and then that Olaf and Alfdis were married and that Aud had passed away. In the end, the saga concludes this digression by saying that those events concerning Aud are told in Laxdæla Saga. So what do we make of this brief cameo appearance? While it may not seem like much at first, Aud is presented here as someone with a prominent reputation who is yet again arranging marriages for her younger kinsmen, which was a role typically in the hands of male kinsmen. Of course, we did hear her do this in other sagas, but we get more detail here, especially in regards to how she handles the process and how others react to her proposals. It is clear from this saga that she was regarded highly by other families in Iceland, and not just her own kinsmen. Her reputation was considered worthy of praise by many good folk, and that is certainly noteworthy. But now I think it is time to consider all of these sagas together, for there are many questions still swirling in our minds. What do we call this remarkable woman, Unn or Aud? Is there any difference between them? What do we make of her various identities? And of course, what did her story mean to the people writing and rewriting it? Let's find out. Since we gathered here today, we have followed the story of Aud the Deep-minded across 5 different works of medieval Icelandic literature, 4 sagas of Icelanders, and the Book of Settlements. But although these stories have all been fairly similar, they have also revealed a surprising amount of variation. Sometimes Aud was called Unn, where she was treated as more of a secular, royal, dynastic, and perhaps even heathen figure, especially in Laxdæla Saga. But then we discovered that Aud was more often called Aud rather than Unn, and that she was a devout Christian before she settled Iceland. Yet even with that identity, she was not always repressed into passivity. At least for a moment in the Book of Settlements, for example, we found out that she still acted independently and impressively when she was faced with a dire situation. So who was this woman, and how do we make sense of all these variations in her story and identity? Normally, I would weave together several voices from academia in order to answer these questions that we end up facing, but today I'd like to focus on the work of one scholar in particular, Sophie van Herpen. She is currently an independent scholar working with Ghent University on a PhD research project, a project that so happens to be focused on making sense of the various representations of Aud/Unn across both medieval and early modern Icelandic literature. In her work, Sophie van Herpen has been building upon the methodological foundations of a scholar named Jan Asman, who has proposed that scholars look at the past as something that is remembered. In other words, instead of trying to figure out what the facts are about Aud, we should be looking at her as a figure of memory, a figure that is portrayed and remembered differently in tradition, legends, and works of literature. When it comes to Aud, Sophie van Herpen suggests that she has generally been remembered in Old Norse literature in 2 ways: as Unn, the heathen founding mother of a new dynasty, and as Aud, a devout Christian settler. But what's interesting is that, out of the 5 sources we covered today, only one saga calls Aud Unn, and that is Laxdæla Saga. Indeed, Sophie von Herpen has pointed out that Laxdæla Saga is a sort of counter-memory, because it contradicts most other texts about Aud, which define the official memory of her, and which prevails in early modern literature. In this saga, Unn is presented to us as a worldly and accomplished woman. Indeed, the saga emphasizes her as a woman with a strong and impressive personality, rather than as a generous religious figure. The best example of this is her burial, where she is placed in a lavish ship filled with prestigious goods. By contradicting the Book of Settlements in this fashion, our unknown saga author gives Unn a burial fit for a queen, and indeed it could be compared to the Osberg ship burial, which was indeed for a woman of royal lineage. Thus, Unn is a version of Aud that prides the more worldly aspects of her story, in other words, her achievements as a woman. She is a secular figure who single-handedly saved her family, established a new dynasty in Iceland, and distributed her wealth to her descendants through marriage arrangements and inheritance. But what about Aud? If Unn is the worldly portrayal of her memory, what do we make of the Aud that appears in our remaining 4 sources? Our other sagas tend to follow the memory of Aud that was established by the Book of Settlements, so that's where we'll be focusing most of our attention now. Although the events are generally the same, Sophie von Herpen notes that the overall narrative of Aud's story in this text is largely male-centered and marginalizes her role. After all, Aud is introduced this time through her husband, Olaf the White, who plays a much larger role in this narrative. In Laxdæla Saga, on the other hand, Olaf was only mentioned in passing, because Unn was the center of focus rather than her male kinsman. Furthermore, it isn't until Aud becomes a widow that we get a glimpse of that Unn we saw in Laxdæla Saga. As we discussed before, this wasn't necessarily an uncommon or unrealistic situation for a woman, but Laxdæla Saga certainly emphasizes her accomplishments more than is typical of the sagas. Sophie von Herpen notes that the Book of Settlements, however, presents her feats in a matter-of-fact style, which may not have come across well in our gathering, since we merely summarized that text. But indeed, a story that once received several chapters in Laxdæla Saga only gets a few brief passages within the Book of Settlements. But the most striking difference between this text and Laxdæla Saga is her death and burial. Unn's burial in Laxdæla Saga was in accordance with a royal and heathen practice, and we have already talked about the implications that had in her portrayal in that saga. But here in the Book of Settlements, which is the only other account that we actually get recounting her death in detail, she is buried on the shore. We spoke about that a little bit before, where we noted that the water was probably thought to be symbolically consecrating the ground. But there's more we can talk about here. In her research, Sophie von Herpen has suggested that this burial illustrates how a noble Christian woman was forced to retreat permanently to the margins of a pagan-dominated society. Throughout her narrative in this source, Sophie argues that Aud is within a liminal space between 2 worlds, reflecting the conflict between a sense of belonging and estrangement that many settlers faced, but also the marginality faced by Christians within a pagan society, and perhaps by women in Norse society in general. But even the uniqueness of her situation as an empowered widow who came to be regarded as a highly respectable and remarkable settler of Iceland. In the end, there are 2 sides to Aud's many sagas. Put most simply, she is both Unn, a heathen figure, and Aud, a Christian figure. But when we look at her stories more deeply, she is both a woman who faced marginalization, but also a woman who found herself empowered as a widow, and who used that situation to attain a highly respectable reputation. And when authors were writing and reworking her story hundreds of years later, they each remembered her differently, emphasizing the qualities and events of her story that they thought best reflected the version of her that was contained within their remembering of the past. And so we end up with 2 figures of memory: Unn, the independent and strong-willed woman whose voice shined above all others, and Aud, the generous and pious Christian woman whose voice sometimes fell beneath the weight of the men around her, such as her brother Bjorn, her husband Olaf the White, and her friend Onund Treefoot. But in both versions of her memory, Aud is always presented to us as a remarkable woman who obtained for herself a highly respected reputation. But I do believe that is quite enough deep thinking for one gathering. As always, I see that some of our lovely guests have fallen into the depths of their mead, for they now dream in another land called slumber. But before our fellowship ends and our wanderings begin, I'd like to know what your favorite part of Aud's story was. What was her most memorable act? Was it her stealthy crafting of a ship in the woods of Scotland? Or was it her bold sailing to Iceland? or perhaps her land taking and distribution to her freed slaves and loyal companions, or maybe even her dignity in the face of death. But which death do we find the most noteworthy? I suspect most of you will vote for the ship burial, but I do wonder what some of you think about her more solemn burial on the shores of the land that she called her new home. But don't forget to check out the Hall's website, where you can find a lovely map illustrating Aud's bold journey. But in the meantime, I would be delighted to hear what your thoughts have been about this gathering. This podcast is still quite young and budding, so there is certainly much that can be improved. If you could be so kind as to leave it a review on iTunes, it would greatly help this hall grow. In fact, it would be like watering a young plant that will one day bear wondrous fruits for all to enjoy. Such support would tremendously help the creation of new content here in the hall, including helpful blog posts and entertaining podcast gatherings. And please, do not forget to check out Sophie von Herpen's wonderful work on her WordPress blog and academia.edu page. It means a great deal to us academic types when we receive support from others, especially when working on independent projects that we share with the world through the power of the internet. But until next time, make sure you have a boat ready in your local forest, because you never know when your family is going to lose power in your neighborhood, and I don't just mean electricity. You may just find yourself needing to save your remaining kinsmen by sailing to a strange new land. I'm Fjorn, your humble skald, and thank you kindly for joining me today.
That's all for today, my friends. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out today's featured artifact on your way out. Also, as a reminder, you can support this show simply by spreading the word on your wings. You can also tip this skald on Ko-fi.com, because I really do enjoy my coffee. And to my fantasy friends, don't forget to check out my free web novels at failnear.com. But until next time, keep wandering.